Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar about curriculum streamlining. I'm Sophie O'Keefe. I'm the Head of Professional Development at English Australia, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. This is a series of 2 webinars. Part 2 will happen same time, same place next week. And we invite you to come along to the second part. If you haven't registered for that one, could you please do so via the English Australia website? I'd like to now introduce today's speaker, David Hill. And David, who's someone who's very well placed to be talking about ILECOS course design. He's been involved in ELT course design and registration for over 2 decades. David is a NEAS assessor and the founder of ELT Support, which is a consultancy that has prepared many courses for ILECOS centres around Australia, as well as many other projects in the areas of assessment, professional development, education management, compliance, and quality. So David will leave about 10 minutes at the end of his presentation today to answer some live questions. So if you do have questions for David, could you please pop them into the Q&A box? And then he'll be able to address those questions at the end of the presentation. All right, I'll hand over to you now, David. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sophie. It's very nice to be here, and thank you very much. I think you do deserve a big thank you for all the work that you've done leading up to this. It's taken a while to organise it, but it's all happening now, so really appreciated, Sophie. Okay, well, we've had an introduction from me, but we did advertise this as being a session that would be useful for a very wide range of people. So to begin with, we just have a couple of questions in a poll, just to find out what the spread of the audience is, what you guys are doing. And then I'll try to adapt the talk as we go to cater for who the audience is. So could you bring up that first poll, Sophie? And then I think the questions will be quite apparent to everyone. Yeah, so if you can just tick, you can choose more than one if you do have multiple roles. And it'll be really interesting to see what we come up with. So off you go, everyone. So not sure quite how the results appear. Oh, there we go. Right. Okay. So nearly 80% teaching us assessing ILECOS, nearly 50% doing curriculum design in ILECOS, nearly 30% doing assessment writing in ILECOS. That's impressive. 42% ILECOS management. So those people would probably be involved in curriculum design or supervising curriculum design. And it's great that we've got other ILECOS staff as well, because I do think marketing staff should know a lot about the curriculum. If they're going to sell courses, understanding how they work is a really important thing. And we've got a couple of people in other areas, so I'll just have a quick look in the comments to see, in the chat, to see what's been written there. Well, we've got a very famous teacher trainer, so thank you for that. Okay, well, thank you. That's given me a good idea of where we're at. But the next one, another question for you. I'm going to try and make this interactive, even though I can't see anyone's faces. If you could put in the Q&A, sorry, in the chat, not the Q&A. If you could put in the chat, why you think curriculum is important. Let's see how many answers we can get, and let's see if they match with the answers I'm going to show you in a moment. So please go ahead, type in the answers. And we have another academic advisor, another non-ELECOS person. So academic advice is great. Not having a curriculum is a really bad idea. I agree. But why is that? A roadmap of what to teach. I really like that one. That's a really good description of what a curriculum is. Establish and maintain a standard. That's a really good one. Quality. Curriculum is related to quality, and that will keep bums on seats. Very, very true. Make learning objectives transparent to learners, which is motivating. Yep, well, I'll say something about that later on. Students, teachers know what to expect. Give directions to students and teachers. Define the desired outcomes. Yes, that's going to be mentioned in more detail later. Set goals and expectations. Great. Teaching quality, working to learning goals, standardized teaching. Students should have an idea of what is to be expected in the course. I think there's some really, really, really good ideas here. So measurable outcomes as well. We'll be talking about that one later as well. Because I must say, I've seen quite a lot of curricula in ELECOS colleges, partly through my work with NEAS and partly through my work with ELT support and the consulting. And there's a very, very wide range of how ELECOS curricula are structured and what they do. But just very briefly, these are my answers, and I think they pretty much coincide with what people put in the chat. So to ensure that teachers are pulling together in the same direction, you don't want one student going to one class and getting taught one way, and then there's a change of teachers and they're actually in the same level of the same course, but being taught a very different way by a new teacher. Curriculum also ensures consistent experience in a very similar way. Curriculum aligns assessment with teaching and learning. Quite a few people mentioned defining the learning goals and learning outcomes and so on. And if teaching, learning, and assessment are both aligned at the same set of goals, then it's all good for everyone. Students know what they're being assessed on. Curriculum also says in reinventing the wheel. I mean, I do remember when I first started teaching many, many years ago now. It doesn't feel like it, but back in the 90s, I remember going into colleges, sometimes quite well-known colleges, and every teacher was given, well, basically told to design their own curriculum. Whatever class, whatever level you were teaching. I remember one place I got shown in by the director of studies to a big storeroom with a big pile of course books and just told to choose one. And then I started reading the blurbs on the back of the books and looking at the table of contents. And I was told, no, you've got to be quicker than that. You've got to choose one quickly. And that was it. Every teacher teaching that level chose a different course book. And then ended up effectively writing a different curriculum, which was a massive waste of effort in many ways. If you could have a single consistent curriculum, it would save teachers an awful lot of work. And the final point here is that it provides support for teachers at different stages in their careers. I'm not going to mention any names here, but I do remember a focus group of one college when I went into, which had a very, shall we say, dare I say, a 1990s approach to curriculum, where teachers were encouraged to write their own curriculum. It was probably a very good professional development opportunity for those teachers who had the time and the enthusiasm to do that properly. But the student focus group was very clear. Students were saying, such and such a teacher is really good, but another teacher does things in a really, really different way, and we don't like it. We just want everyone, we want all the teachers to be teaching at a much higher level. And if there is a single consistent curriculum, then that means that the less experienced teachers have something to go by, probably something that was designed by the more experienced teachers. And that just means that the baseline that the teachers work to starts off at a much higher level. It doesn't mean that there's any less need to innovate and come up with good ideas. A good curriculum will give the flexibility for teachers with good ideas to go above and beyond, do things in new ways, share those ideas with the other teachers, and maybe those new ideas end up part of the curriculum as it's reviewed and renewed. So, okay, that's established why curriculum is important. Just a very quick look through what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at what's needed in a curriculum. We're going to look at some useful resources that will make the curriculum design process much easier. We're going to have a look at curriculum in other sectors of education, higher education, and even vocational education, and see what we can learn from that and what we can apply to ILECOS. Because I know that actually ILECOS is very good at providing ideas to other sectors that they can take on board, but I do think there are some things we can learn from other sectors as well. We're going to go through, for the practically minded people amongst you, which I would imagine is a majority. There's going to be plenty for you later on in the talk. We're going to talk about how to implement the approach I'm going to talk about, which should make designing an effective, compliant, benchmarked curriculum a relatively easy task. And I think that's going to be a good thing for many people, because people have different ideas about curriculum design. Some people love it. Some people find it a bit of an arduous chore. I hope what we're going to do today is make life a bit easier for those people who find curriculum a bit arduous, and make it easy for you. And certainly it's what we're going to talk about is the approach that ERT support has been using for many years. And that is something that ASQA, TEXA, and so on seem to have very little problem in ticking off and signing off as being registered. So good news there. At the end, as Sophie mentioned, we'll have 10 minutes for questions and answers. But if you do come up with ideas as we go, and I know it's very hard sometimes to remember a question at the end, do feel free to throw it in the Q&A box as we go, and it'll be there ready for us when we come to the end of the session. So what's in a curriculum? We have another poll for you now. So this one gives you 7 things, and just tick as many of the items as you like. You can tick all of them if you like. What do you think should be included in a curriculum? Which of these, are there any here that you would not include in curriculum design, that you would not consider in curriculum design? I'll give you another minute, I think, to make your selections. Some of these will be very obvious, some may be a little bit less obvious. But let's see what you come up with. Okay, here we go. Here we go with the results. As I thought, 100% said syllabus would be in the curriculum. Completely agree. 100% said, I'm sure we can make a TV game show out of this one. 100% said assessment framework should be in the syllabus. I completely agree. 91% said that materials and resources should be specified in the curriculum. I agree with that. I think if you didn't do that, you might have a problem with ASCRA and or TEXA and or NIAS. Classroom design is an interesting one. Now, you won't find anything in the ILECOS standards or the NIAS standards that talk about classroom design being part of curriculum. But I think I would argue, I mean, it's definitely a debatable point, but I would argue that classroom design is something that could be specified within a curriculum. Policies and procedures for teaching and assessments, 74% of you said that. I would say yes, it should be included. You'll find within the ILECOS standards, which are the minimum legal requirements for an ILECOS college, or for any ILECOS college that teaches students on student visas. You will find that you will need policies and procedures for assessment validation, assessment moderation, assessment marking, and things like that. So yes, that would be included within curriculum. Now, professional development and teacher induction. Again, an interesting one. As with classroom design, I completely understand if you didn't tick this one. But I would actually say that professional development and teacher induction are two things that should be specified within the curriculum. NIAS actually requests that you have a section on teacher requirements within the curriculum documentation that you submit to NIAS. And I would actually argue that every teacher, unless it's a very much an emergency relief situation, should be inducted into what the curriculum talks about, what the syllabus talks about, what the expectations of the curriculum are for teachers, for teaching and learning, for assessments, and so on. And having professional development aligned to the needs of the curriculum can only be a good thing. So I would actually argue it's integral to curriculum, but I do understand not everyone would automatically include it. Now, marketing information about the course. That is very interesting, that only 20% said that. Now, I think with anything, if what you do isn't communicated, in some ways, it might as well not exist. And marketing is a very important part of communication. So if your college has a new course and the marketing people start selling it and the information they're given isn't aligned to the curriculum, then there's going to be a problem. You're going to have students enrolling in the course who don't know what to expect, who might be expecting something quite different, and that is not going to be a recipe for happy students. So I would actually strongly argue that marketing information should be strongly related to the curriculum. And in fact, you will find that a NIAS course application requires marketing information to be submitted as part of a new course application. And you'll find that ASCRA and TEXA will expect, for example, the learning outcomes in the course to be mentioned or at least available to students before enrollment so that they can, if they wanted to, use them as part of their decision as to which course to enroll in or even which college to enroll in. So thank you very much. Not quite a trick question, I don't think, but all of those answers, I believe, are part of a curriculum. And yeah, we've got them all there on the slides as well. So the next one, I've mentioned briefly the ILECOS standards. I perhaps should have asked at the beginning if everyone here is in Australia. I'm guessing that most of you are. But as I briefly mentioned, the ILECOS standards, the minimum legal requirements for colleges that teach English language to students on student visas in Australia. But above the ILECOS standards, there's quite a few other things that can be used to help design curricula. So these are a bit more aspirational. Might be a little bit unusual to mention NEAS in an English Australia webinar, but I do think that both organisations, English Australia and NEAS, complement each other very well. And I think it's worth mentioning what each organisation provides that can be very useful resources. Now, if you go to the NEAS website and you go to the forms section, I think it's called resources now, actually. And if you download the A102 course application form, if you scroll past the first couple of pages, you'll come to a course application guide, which is extremely useful. It's kind of almost the Bible for putting together an ILECOS course. It provides some extremely useful information in a very concise way. And if you follow that, you can't really go wrong. Most of what you need is there. Not every college is a NEAS member, but those who are will find that they have to follow NEAS Quality Area A. And Quality Area A is about teaching and assessments, and many of the what they call the quality principles and the quality drivers within that are related to curriculum, including assessment. So if you're not familiar with it, and even if you're not a NEAS member, I would strongly advise having a look at it. And another document also on the NEAS website, whoops, sorry about that. Going back to the correct slide now, the NEAS Quality Practice Guide is an incredibly useful resource. I think it's much underused. Even though it's a few years old now, it still is absolutely jam-packed with ideas, not just about curriculum and assessment, but in every aspect of running an ILECOS college. So if you're an ILECOS manager or you're aspiring to be an ILECOS manager, then I would strongly recommend that you make yourself familiar with the Quality Practice Guide if you're not already. It is just full of bullet points. Anytime you're thinking, I wonder if we can come up with a good idea here. We're a bit stuck for ideas in this area, whether it's student welfare, whether it's premises, whether it's materials and resources, you will probably find inspiration in that document. And in a similar vein, the English Australia Best Practice Guides, I believe they're available for free to member colleges. So if you're a teacher and you're interested and you're working for an EA member college, ask your academic manager about these. Reading them is excellent professional development. If you're not an EA member, I'm sure Sophie will correct me on this at the end of the talk if I've got this wrong, but I believe they're available for purchase. But there are various that I don't believe there's one that covers curriculum design as a single standalone volume, but there are quite a few that relate quite strongly to curriculum design. So monitoring student progress, validation and moderation supplements. There's one about direct entry programs. There's one about direct entry programs that relates very heavily to curriculum design. And there's one about managing professional development, which, as I said a few minutes ago, it's good if that is aligned with the curriculum. So lots of excellent resources there. And even that is enough to keep you occupied for quite a good many hours of bedtime reading, shall we say, if you're that interested. But how systematic are all of those guides? Now, that is an interesting question. We'll answer that in a moment. But first, let's take a little bit of a quick look at some other sectors and how they look at curriculum design. And this is where I think there may be one or two things that we can learn from the other sectors. If we look at higher education first, those of you who've worked or do work in universities may have heard the term constructive alignment. Now, that is something that it's not mentioned directly in the Higher Education Standards Framework, which is the equivalent of the ILECOS Standards, but for higher education. But if you follow that, you will probably be implementing constructive alignment. And constructive alignment is based around a hierarchy of outcomes. We'll see more about that in a moment in the next slide. And a key thing is that if you follow constructive alignment, the same learning outcomes will be used for teaching learning as will be used for assessment. And those things are aligned. You can't help it. You can't help but align them if you follow constructive alignment, which is in contrast, to be honest, to quite a few. I would say the biggest problem, the biggest issue, and the biggest cause of non-compliance actually I see in ILECOS curricula is a lack of alignment between the teaching and learning activities and the assessment. It's surprisingly common. Many people think if they just follow one of the UK General English course books, then teaching, learning, and assessment are automatically aligned. It's not, to be honest, not necessarily the case. More about that later. So I mentioned on the last slide the constructive alignment hierarchy, and this kind of summarizes it from top down. Universities generally have a set of what they call graduate attributes. And those are things like, they're usually just very short, sharp statements of things that they feel that all of their graduates should be capable of doing at a very, very high level. So I've just given one example here. The flowchart really is just examples. One is critical thinking. Other things are things like knowledge of the discipline, which is what you would expect from universities. But also things like the kind of things that employers are asking for more and more nowadays, like spoken and written communication, working with others, collaboration, digital literacy, information literacy, media literacy, things like that. And aligned to those graduate attributes are higher level learning outcomes. So they tend to be called things like course learning outcomes, program learning outcomes, that kind of thing. So they're at the very highest level. Someone who completes a degree course, degree program, through all the modules, units, subjects, whatever you want to call them, that they do, they should meet these high-level learning outcomes. So an example is here. A critical thinking related one is that graduates apply knowledge of whatever the subject is in a critical way to real-world problems. So you can see the alignment there. Critical thinking is aligned to a learning outcome related to critical thinking. Now, this is a kind of a degree level, program level. In Australia, as we know, degrees tend to be made up of lots of different subjects, and there are learning outcomes as well. I'm sorry, I keep clicking when I intend to just move my mouse around. There are learning outcomes at the subject level as well, called subject learning outcomes. Sometimes the word intended is put in there, and that's really to distinguish from the other meaning of learning outcomes, which is what students actually achieve at the end of their course. So the intended learning outcomes and what you put into the curriculum design, you intend that by following the curriculum, students will have achieved those learning outcomes. What's sometimes meant by learning outcomes, though, is quite different, and that's what students actually achieve at the end of their course. You would hope they match up, but not necessarily. Anyway, so here's an example of a subject learning outcome. So it's a bit more detailed than the related course level learning outcome, but you can actually see very clearly how it's related. And then the question arises as to how do we know that students have actually met or achieved a learning outcome? And one way of doing that is to incorporate the learning outcome into the assessment criteria. So you've all probably seen, I'm probably talking at quite an abstract level at the moment, but we will see some examples either later in today's session or in next week's session. But you've all seen, I'm sure, the kind of assessment marking rubrics, I call them, rubrics in American English, where you've got a grid of usually different criteria across the top and different grades down the sides, and each box has some text in it which tells you what the student has to do in order to be awarded the appropriate grade. So one of those boxes that relates to this learning outcome might say this, that in a particular essay, for example, a student has selected a theory and supported it using to come to logical conclusions based on evidence. So the key thing is that throughout that hierarchy, right from the very top, from what every university student is expected to do, through the course level, through the subject level, right down to the assessment task level, there's an alignment all the way through. And obviously, the teaching as well should be aligned to the learning outcomes in the same way. If that isn't clear, let me know in the Q&A and we can talk about it when we come to the questions at the end. Vocational education, let's have a look at a very different sector now. Now, vocational education takes a different approach to the same thing. They don't use the term constructive alignment, but they do use terms such as training packages and accredited courses. And those training packages and accredited courses comprise qualifications. Some of you will know this, some of you won't, so I'll go through it for those of you who are not familiar with it. So each qualification, a qualification might be a certificate in business administration, a diploma of business management, an advanced diploma of human resources management, for example. But no matter what the qualification, whether it's in management, whether it's in carpentry, whether it's in aged care, whether it's in metalworking, welding, whatever, they're all structured in pretty much the same way. It's a very systematic process. And again, the terminology is very different from higher education, but the process, the hierarchy is very, very similar. And again, the result is the same, but there is an alignment between what's taught and hopefully learned and what's assessed. And the way that's learned is through written statements, which we can call outcomes. So this is the diagram for the vocational qualification hierarchy in Australia. So for example, a certificate 4 in human resource management is comprised of a number of units of competency. A little bit like a degree is comprised of a number of subjects. So this is an example of a unit of competency could be, this is a real one, lead difficult conversations. Within that unit of competency, there is a standard set of elements of competency. So no matter where that unit of competency is taught, in Australia, sometimes they're even taught overseas, that has to include the same set of elements of competency, and the teaching and the assessment has to be against those elements of competency. And again, more detailed level of the hierarchy, the elements of competency are broken down into several performance criteria. So this one, again, a real example. The element facilitate difficult conversation is broken down into several, which include provide opportunity for stakeholder input. So I think you're seeing a familiar pattern. Do we do this in ILECOS? Well, it's a very good question, that one. Some colleges do, but I see many colleges that don't. And what I see is that the colleges who don't do this tend to have, like I mentioned before, students mentioning that the teaching is not as consistent, teachers mentioning that there's a lack of consistency between the teachers, different students in different classes might be getting a very, very different experience. There ends up being a lack of certainty and a lot of debate about whether students are ready for the next level or not. So basically, a good way to summarize it, I think, is the colleges that do have a hierarchy similar to what I've just explained in vet and higher education seem to enable a much better experience for the students and the teachers than the colleges that don't implement this hierarchy. So how should we describe that hierarchy for ILECOS? Well, there are some clues. If we have a look at the ILECOS standards, the most recent version, the 2018 version, actually the older 2015 version wasn't much different. We have, for example, standard C 1.1. There has to be a course syllabus that provides a statement of the purpose and objectives of the course, the expected learning outcomes, the subjects, structure, and assessment of learning and progress. Now, I've put the most important of those in color. Yes, okay, there's a lot of colleges that they specify the expected learning outcomes, but I see a massive range in interpretation of what those expected learning outcomes or intended learning outcomes are. Some of them just take them straight from one of the UK course books. The challenge there, as we'll see soon, is that you end up with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of learning outcomes. You can't possibly assess all of them. And it just becomes very unmanageable to do it in a systematic way. But let's look at another standard. Standard P 3.1D from the ILECOS standards. Students are informed of the outcomes to be achieved from the course, and for each learning block, the learning outcomes for the block. What I've tried to do is use the color to kind of match up the terminology between the different standards. But this one here is talking about the course level and uses the word outcomes, as opposed to C.1.1, which talks at the course level and uses the word objectives. Not quite sure what's going on there. It's not very consistent. I think next time as an industry, we get a chance to provide input on this, I think we should ask for some consistency. We should ask the government to be a bit more consistent in the terminology they're using. We've got expected learning outcomes there, and we've got learning outcomes here. They seem to be the same thing. I assume they are. Following that assumption, things seem to come across as compliant. So yeah, works for me, but it's not very clear in the standards. P4.1b, regularly evaluating learning outcomes achieved. And then P4.3c, regularly evaluating course outcomes achieved. I think they're talking about different things here. Not 100% sure, but we just have to make some assumptions. But what the approach I've used to kind of overcome this ambiguity and to present things in a way that I think another advantage of presenting things in this way is that when you're speaking with people from the other sectors, and this happens a lot in multi-sector organizations. So if you're in an ILECOS college that's also a vet provider or a higher education provider, a university, then it's always good if the different sectors are speaking the same language as each other. And perhaps even more importantly, those of you who are academic managers and even in marketing, or your teachers who are interested in being in academic management in the future, you may well be involved in negotiating direct entry agreements with other sectors, where the assessment in your ILECOS centre is taken as the equivalent of IELTS 5.5, 6, 6.5 or whatever for direct entry into another institution. Sometimes those are handled purely through marketing. Other times you do have to put together a pretty solid proposal that shows how you are sure that your assessments in ILECOS are equivalent to IELTS 5.5, 6, or whatever. And if you're speaking this language here in this table, if you're using a similar hierarchy that higher education and vet use, that job is much easier and you're much more likely to have success. And that especially helps with the higher end providers who charge higher fees and probably better to be associated with. So this is what I use. At the course level, I talk about course purpose and course objectives. If you use a course provided by ELT support, it will have these stated very clearly. At the level, I'm kind of saying here that in higher education, you have subjects. In vocational, you have units of competency with elements of competency. At the ILECOS level, let's talk about levels here. So the course level in ILECOS would be, say, a general English course as opposed to an English for academic purposes course. A general English course would have one course purpose, several objectives which cover the whole of the general English course. And then at each level and for each skill, there would be a set of learning outcomes. And then for each assessment, I'll talk about listening and reading next week, but it's much easier to talk about speaking and writing at this level. Usually marking rubrics are used there. And if those are aligned such that the pass grade is aligned with the intended learning outcomes, I'm sorry, that should be ILOs for intended learning outcomes rather than SLOs. I'll correct this before I distribute it. Then what it means is that your assessment is aligned with the learning outcomes. Also, if teachers at the beginning of each lesson, they mention which learning outcomes the lesson is aligned with, that will make things very, very clear. And if the curriculum and the syllabus within the curriculum states all of these things, then you're going to be speaking the same language as people in higher education and vets, or at least a language that's easily translatable. You'll be providing something that every teacher understands. We'll talk a little bit later on and probably next week about how students can understand it as well. We'll talk next week about how it's useful for marketing. But through everything being aligned, everything's very clear, everything's systematic, no confusion. Now, we only have a few minutes before questions and answers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start something that I'll finish later. I'll finish next week. So this actually comes from the going back to NEAS and the course application guide. These are some of the specifications for learning outcomes that are given there. And this goes back probably about 10 years or so to a series of professional developments that many of you will know Anna Brakovic and Marion Bongo, who put together some excellent professional development sessions, and they talked about how to write learning outcomes that met these requirements. So we'll do a bit more on that next week, where I stand on the shoulders of those great people. So ideally, learning outcomes are written in a way that is specific and measurable, that is comprehensible to teachers. The challenge is making them comprehensible to students. So especially at beginner level, elementary, even pre-intermediate level can be quite challenging. Limited in number, as I said before, if you've got 100 of them per level, it's not going to work. It's just too many. A good rough number, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, something like that per skill, per level is manageable, and in line with usually what happens in higher education and vets. Use active verbs, we'll see some examples probably next week. Specify an observable behavior so that it's accessible. So you can write it down in an assessment rubric, so that you know whether a student is actually achieving the outcome or not in a consistent way that different teachers with a little bit of training will interpret in the same way. Include conditions for demonstrating learning. So, for example, if it's writing one, how long the essay is. If it's a speaking one and it's giving a talk, how long that talk is, what kind of audience it is, and so on. Enable assessments to align with teaching. Those are all actually in orange, because if you do all of those, you will find that the learning outcomes are accessible and they differentiate between the levels as well, because that's another important thing. If you've got a pronunciation learning outcome at pre-intermediate and another one at intermediate, you'll want them to be written differently so that the lower one is something that can be achieved at the lower of those two levels, and the higher one is just a little bit more challenging. And a really important thing is that learning outcomes are used to communicate what the course does. So in some ways, learning outcomes are a way to make sure that the course does what it says on the tin. It's an odd expression, but it's one I often use when it comes to learning outcomes. And I'll go to one example here. Can write academic essays of around 1,000 words that follow an appropriate genre related to the question they address. And just going through those criteria again. Specific, it is specific, it's 1,000 words. genre is appropriate. The essay is related to the question they address. Obviously, this is quite a high level English for academic purposes one. Next criteria on the previous slide was that it's comprehensible to teachers and students. This is definitely comprehensible to teachers. It's very clear. At the level that it's used at, it should be pretty comprehensible to students. You might have to teach what the word genre means or replace it with a different word, but the student should really be able to know what criteria they're being assessed against. Limited in number was the next of the criteria. Well, that's only one, so there shouldn't be 20 more of these. There should only be one of the 4 or 5. It should use active verbs, so we've got write. It should specify an observable behavior. Write academic essays of around 1,000 words. It's definitely observable. It should include conditions for demonstrating learning. So we've got genre related to the question they address. It should enable assessment to align with teaching. That was the next of the criteria. And if your lessons are aligned to helping students do this, and your assessments are aligned to whether or not they have done this, then you have that alignment between teaching and assessment. And the final criterion was that they can be used to communicate what the course does. If you have on your college's website that students will be writing academic essays of around 1,000 words, blah, 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 then students will be prepared for what they have to do in the course. They'll know what they're signing up for. And it's actually also easy to communicate that that course prepares students for university. So that shows that this particular learning outcome, you're probably looking for an example of a learning outcome that meets those criteria. And here it is. We'll continue this next week. We've got a few examples of bad criteria for you to improve on. But for now, I'll just skip through, and we've got, I think, 7 minutes left. I'm running slightly late for questions and answers. So back over to Sophie.
Great. Thank you so much, David. There are a couple of questions already for you. The first one is, what's the difference between writing course objectives and learning outcomes? If you can explain in your own words.
Okay, I'm just wondering whether I should stop sharing when I answer.
Yep. Either way, would you like me to do that for you?
I think I've done it, yes. So difference between objectives and outcomes. That is definitely a debatable question. The terminology is so ambiguous and confusing. Even in the ILECOS standards, my own way of addressing that, and anyone who's using a curriculum that ELT support has provided for them will find that we do this. The way I've interpreted the ILECOS standards is that the objectives are at a course level, and therefore they're bigger picture than the learning outcomes. The learning outcomes are quite a bit more detailed. So within each level, there will be a set of outcomes addressing each skill. So if you're breaking the skills down into your traditional reading, writing, speaking, and listening, you'll have a set of reading outcomes at pre-intermediate level, set of speaking outcomes at pre-intermediate level, and so on.
And for the course outcomes, do you have a recommended number like you did for the learning outcomes?
I would say go for roughly half a dozen again, because again, I mean, I've heard different interpretations of this. The standard reference on constructive alignments, as we talked about for higher education, Biggs and Tang book, which I would highly recommend if you're really interested in course design. That recommends 4, 5, 6, something of that order per subject. So if you look at a typical student workload, we're doing, say, 4 subjects at university, 4 skills in a 4-time ELECOS course. So yeah, that number 456 would align. Another way that it's been explained to me is you've probably heard that thing where the human mind can easily remember roughly half a dozen things. You'd be superhuman if you could remember more than 7 things at once. So that kind of order of magnitude, 456 items, is manageable. It's possible to internalize it relatively easily. Going above that, you're probably going to make things more difficult than it needs to be.
Yeah, wonderful. That makes a lot of sense. There's another question from Amandeep, who's asking if you have any specific advice for PTE course curricula.
Oh, right. That's
A
an
big
interesting
question.
one.
Yeah.
I'm working on one of those at the moment.
Oh, well, you probably do have a little bit of advice then.
Yeah, just working through the how to reconcile it. It's really interesting to try to apply this to exam preparation because like with a general English course or an EAP course, the end result is your own college's internal exams. With an exam preparation course, the end result is really success on an external exam that you don't have any control over or any say over. And with the Pearson test of English in particular, the complexities behind the algorithms that are used to determine the scores. For one thing, they're top secrets. And for another thing, they're too complex really to use easily. So I would, for PTE, I would have a look at the official guide. I would have a look at the other resources. There's the Pearson Expert PTEA books. There's the Practice Test Plus books. And there's a few online resources as well. And within those, you should be I do remember a few years ago, there was a score guide, which does provide some criteria that we use within PTEA for training the AI algorithms. And I would use those as a starting point. Just a little bit of a disclaimer there. I was one of the authors of the PTE official guide, the current one, and of the expert PTEA books.
Great, thank you.
Any
All
more
right,
questions?
probably the last question, if you could answer it briefly, is from Snow. How can the integration of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and online learning platforms be harnessed to enhance the effectiveness and accessibility of VET curriculum while ensuring equitable access and maintaining the human touch in education?
Oh, that's a good one. For VET curriculum, that's interesting. I would, yeah, for VET curriculum, it's a bit more tricky because you don't have a lot of control over it because it's the training packages which are written through a very, very slow process, which is probably not keeping up with AI. I would love to answer that question for ELECOS, and I think the best way to do that is to dive into it in more detail next week. It does remind me that I forgot to mention a little bit on one of my earlier slides today about how I think there's a great opportunity in ELECOS to differentiate courses by adding a little bit of extra, whether that is what people generally call 21st century skills. You can include critical thinking, digital literacy, collaboration skills, things like that in them. I think there's a great opportunity there, and I would love to talk a little bit more about that amongst many other things next Tuesday. So thank you for the questions.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, David. So I've just popped the link for next week's webinar into the chat if you haven't registered for it already and would like to. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you very much, David, for that very thorough and clear exploration of constructive alignment and learning outcomes as well, which is definitely the foundations of course curriculum. So thank you so much.
And thank you very much, Sophie. And thank you for everyone who attended. And I look forward to seeing you back here this time next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we stay on and wait for everyone to go? Or?
No, I think I'll end it here and then we can chat later.
Okay, sure.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.